Canadians are accustomed to thinking that birds go south for the winter. For about 1,300 trumpeter swans, going south for the winter from their breeding grounds in Alaska means flying to Comox Valley on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. At about 49.5 degrees north of the equator, the Comox Valley is not exactly a tropical paradise. However, the area does provide a rich and varied habitat for a multitude of waterfowl and other wildlife. The first swans to arrive, sometimes less than 100, start coming at the end of October, just after the potato harvest. They tend to favor the potato fields where the culls lie. The varied topographical features that attract the swans to the Comox Valley, such as marshes, farms, fields, and the Courtney River estuary, provide the naturalist with many excellent viewing opportunities. Over the years, the Comox Strathcona Natural History Society and the Ministry of Environment have been keeping track of the swans. Each year, the Trumpeter Swan counts showed increasing numbers in the Comox Valley. There had at one time been great concern that these birds were on the verge of extinction.
We've been doing the Trumpeter Swan count for 4 years now. We are the birding members of the Comox Strathcona Natural History Society. We've done it out of interest. Of course, the results go to the Canadian Wildlife Service, but we've done it out of interest because this part of Canada has the highest count of trumpeter swans. So the way it's arranged, this year we have a coordinator called Doug Innes, and he makes sure everybody's going to count the designated places that the swans will be. We all have our own areas. I think he has 13 groups, and each person knows where they go. We all arrive there and start counting exactly at 10 o'clock in the morning, so there's no overlap. If we even see swans flying from one area to another, those are kept track of so that the other group they might have flown in on, we coordinate that, and so they're not doubly counted.
In 1989, an aerial survey was conducted, again with the Canadian Wildlife Service and Ministry of Environment. That flight determined that the population of swans on Vancouver Island is approximately 2,800 birds. Major concentrations of swans are found now in the Courtney-Comox area, the Nanaimo area, Duncan area, and south. The Ministry of Environment is cooperating with Ducks Unlimited and the Canadian Wildlife Service in a program called Pacific Coast Joint Venture. This is to address the problems of swans in agriculture and hopefully come to some resolutions.
By December, between 500 and 700 swans are found in the area, and in January those numbers will have doubled. Once the potato culls are gone, the swans forage on any grass crops they can find. Local farmlands provide the principal food requirements of the swans and other waterfowl.
Now the question comes up quite often is why Comox is so particularly attractive to trumpeter swans. We believe it has something to do with the pattern that they fly on in their migration. Comox basically is the northern extent of intensive agriculture in British Columbia on the coast. So what we tend to think is happening is the swans fly down the east side of the coast range, egress to the coast via the inlets, and bang, at Comox they're focused right on that area by 3 major inlets. So this sort of is the first patch of green they encounter on their way south, and it's just become a mecca for them. What we see, I think, when they're using estuaries now is a fairly traditional form of use of winter habitat. And what they're feeding on in those estuaries are the rhizomes of the intertidal or emergent plants that grow there, primarily 3-square bulrush and some of the sedges. Now these plants die back in the winter and store most of their reserves in their root system. These are very high in carbohydrates, which to swans would be a good source of energy for the cold winter period.
When there is snow on the ground, the estuary, which is kept ice-free by the salt water and tidal action, is the only natural feeding ground open to the swans. Estuarine habitats such as this prove to be critical for the survival of wintering waterfowl. A magnificent bird, the trumpeter swan is the largest in the swan family, weighing up to 13 kilograms and averaging 1.5 meters in length, with a wingspan of approximately 3 meters. Immature swans are gray in contrast to the white of an adult. As many as 6 have been seen in a family unit. Studies during the late 1970s indicate that an adult swan eats roughly 4.5 kilograms of grass per day. It is not surprising, then, that not everyone greets the fall arrival of trumpeter swans with anticipation and pleasure. For the farmers, wintering waterfowl have wreaked havoc on their operations. But it hasn't always been like that.
I remember the swans showing up here in the early 60s. There was just a pair, and they came one winter, and they stayed all winter, and actually we didn't know what they were at first. We had never seen them, and it wasn't until quite a while later that we identified them as trumpeter swans and as an endangered species, and we thought, well, this was just really special for us to have a pair of trumpeter swans here on the farm. By the late 60s and early 70s, I remember the trumpeter swans wintering here on our grass fields, probably in the numbers of 150 to 200 birds in the wintertime. And it was about that time that we started to notice our grass production in our fields diminish, and we didn't really connect that the swans in our grass yields were connected. But when the population of the birds got up to around 200 to 300 birds wintering on our grass fields, we noticed a tremendous loss in hay production, silage production. And we started to observe what these birds were doing, and they were actually going out and eating the grass right down to the roots and pulling the roots out of the ground and digging holes in the fields. And this ended up costing us, $50,000 to $100,000 a year in crop losses, reseeding costs, and going out and buying feed that we were short of to feed our cattle.
Many farmers find the swans objectionable. We don't at all. They're not a problem to us. They haven't been ever since we've been here. And the main reason is because our crops are basically all harvested and gone by the time the swans come, and they're put in after the swans leave. And therefore they're only here when we normally keep the fields flooded anyhow. There's lots of ducks and geese, and the swans just fit in perfectly. But we enjoy having them. We like them. They don't do us any harm at all. In fact, they rather help us, because the little potatoes that are left in the field, which would become a weed the next year, the swans eat them. And they end up, as you can see, with a nice clean field with no volunteers at all. We're happy for them.
Swans not only eat the winter grass crops, they create a potentially dangerous puddling effect, particularly in low-lying areas.
Why did swans make these holes? Now, as far as I knew, last fall, I had never seen swans make holes in the ground, and I had heard from other farmer friends that oftentimes they would make a hole that's 3-4 feet in diameter and a foot or more deep, which means that when you drive in the field in the spring with a tractor, the wheels can drop in and it can be a dangerous situation. And I didn't think I had any holes. Well, that doesn't turn out to be the case. In fact, when I was working my ground this spring, I discovered several of these holes.
We had a lot of ponding or puddling of our soils. I don't know, there's a wet area here. I don't know if you can see it or not, but that's what the swans would do to our fields in the wintertime. They come in with their large feet. They'd be like the size of your palms, and they'd puddle in these wet areas and smother the grass. And the soil particles would layer up, layer after layer in the water, and the water just won't drain away. And we found that we couldn't get on the fields and put our fertilizer on until, say, late May, early June, which would be a month to a month and a half later than normally we would experience. And the sum sort of total of damage of the swans would be, we would lose our first crop of grass, which is our main forage crop for feeding our dairy herd. We'd have to go out and reseed that field in the spring, and that would cost us anywhere from $200 to $300 an acre. And we'd end up buying an extra $40,000 to $50,000 worth of feed a year to replace that first crop loss.
Farmers have tried a variety of tactics to get the swans off their fields. At best, the swans move to another farm, often returning to the first farm at night.
We've used cracker shells, dogs, manually going out and scaring them, and even bird shot to try and scare these birds off, all with no success.
In 1981, letters to various ministries seeking compensation for crop damage served to prove that, while there was much empathy, no one seemed to be able to accept the responsibility for this problem. By now, the number of swans had grown up to 330 on one farm.
Dear Edgar, I can readily appreciate your growing concern arising from larger bird numbers and increased damage caused to your pastures. I've referred the matter to the Deputy Minister of Environment with a recommendation that some form of compensation be considered for special situations.
Dear Mr. Smith, this ministry does not provide compensation for damage caused by wildlife. The problem of crop damage by swans is being investigated by the Canadian Wildlife Service and staff of this ministry. I will also refer the complaint to the Problem Wildlife Advisory Committee to see if they can make suggestions to reduce the problem.
Dear Mr. Smith, I too regret that I am unable to authorize direct financial compensation. Negotiations, however, are in progress with our provincial counterparts. It is unfortunate when so much of our wildlife heritage is diminishing that a species apparently recovering from near extinction is now becoming a pest.
Several years back, when I was doing my study and realized that swans could have an impact on these grass fields and therefore on the local farmers, we were seeking ways that we could capitalize on the fields that were left fallow over the winter. At that time, most of these fields had been used for corn, which was harvested by the dairy farmers as silage. So my idea was perhaps there's some way we can plant these to cover crops that the swans would be allowed to use, while at the same time we would discourage their use on the established pastures. So what we attempted to do was to seed these cornfields before they'd been harvested by broadcasting the seed from an airplane. This had marginal success. Some of the problems were that the corn was so very tall that not very much seed got to the ground. It hung up in the plants, so when the plants were harvested, most of the seed went up into the forage harvester as well.
Meanwhile, other forces were at work which would prove to have a big effect on the Comox Valley. Canada and the United States signed the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, which was designed to assist both waterfowl and the farmers in sensitive areas. The Comox Valley was recognized as an area requiring attention. Maintenance of viable mixed agriculture is key to preserving much of the critical habitat, as is the minimization of conflicts between agriculture and wildlife. At the invitation of the BC Ministry of Agriculture, a local group from the Comox Valley put together a proposal for the Pacific Coast Venture Group. A coordinator, Graham Fowler, was hired to monitor and report on the project.
The Comox Valley Waterfowl project was put together to relieve some of the pressure from the farmers that the trumpeter swans are impacting on their fields. There's three basic programs involved in the project. One is to plant cover crops in some of the pastures to lure the swans from the dairy pastures. Another aspect of the project is to scare trumpeter swans from dairy pastures. And the third aspect is to just monitor the swans and what they're doing in the pastures. The first aspect was cover cropping, and the project would reimburse farmers $25 per acre for winter cereals and annual ryegrass cover crops. We have 25 local farmers cooperating with the project, and we have 423 acres currently under cover crops.
I have found that with the help of Ducks Unlimited and other farmers who have put in lure crops early in the fall, that they have been a significant help to keeping the swans away from my fields. My soils and location, the best thing for me would be to have no swans. However, I am quite willing to work with Ducks Unlimited to get a good compromise so that I can make a good living on and have decent forages.
When the swans have decided to leave an area, they first indicate this by bobbing their heads and calling single notes for several minutes. Finally, at a moment only they understand, the flock begins the takeoff.
Once the vegetable fields are depleted in food value, they move on to the dairy pastures. This is where I employ the scare tactics. Initially, I could get very close to the swans when I first started the scare program. As time went on and I used the various methods, they got wise and I couldn't get very close to them at all. The beginning would have been about 50 meters, and now it's about 150 to 200 meters.
Graham Fowler came along one day and introduced himself to be working for Ducks Unlimited to control these swans out here, and he said he left me his phone number and asked me if I ever had any trouble to phone him. So I had approximately 200 on here one day, so I phoned him, and he came out right away, and he said, I will string this string up with some ribbons on it and to see if it works, see if they come back. But I've had no problem with them since he strung the ribbons up.
Some flooded fields are also used to overnight on. This may be because the swans feel secure with lots of water around. Other swans leave just before or just after dark to find their way to a body of water for the night. This may mean flying to the Comox Harbor or a nearby marsh. The arrivals and departures at these overnight areas are noisy affairs. In the morning, there is quite a ritual preceding the departure. Finally, the swans begin to patter along the surface of the water like some huge aircraft requiring a long runway. Their large wings get them airborne, and with much calling or trumpeting, they circle before heading off to their favorite fields.
With this program of lure crops, we hope to find a balance whereby society and the public in general who appreciate the swans are willing to put up enough funding to allow the farmers to grow these lure crops on their fields and feed the swans through the winter time. And if we can do that in conjunction with maybe determining a limit of the swans that the Comox Valley can support in this type of program, I think there's a good possibility that the dairy industry and the trumpeter swans can find a pretty happy coexistence. I know on my farm, for example, I've been very happy with the results. I have a new seeding of ryegrass, which in the past 10 years has been the prime target of swans wintering here. I could have suffered 50% loss on that new seeding. And this winter, due to the program we've got going here, I've got virtually no loss at all.
The swans' behavior pattern continues throughout the winter. By late February, some of the swans have begun the journey north. The swans are beginning to get restless, with March swan counts showing decreasing numbers. By April, only a small number can still be found, until they too listen to the urge to fly north.
We planted about 14 farms where we planted cover crops on the vegetable fields. In almost all cases, the crops grew, in some cases more than others. Only about half of the fields were utilized by the swans. In some areas, even though we had short, succulent grasses growing, the swans didn't eat these, and they'd feed in fields adjacent to that, and we haven't exactly determined why this is, but it appears that with the crops that we planted later on in the season, some of them we didn't plant until early October. Luckily we had a warm fall and we got some germination on the fields and some successful growth there, but it didn't seem to be enough to attract the swans. They seemed to like a thicker, lusher grass crop like a pasture, and that tells us that we'll have to plant earlier this year, preferably in August, and one of the problems we face there is the timing of when the vegetables come off the fields or when the corn is harvested, and that is again dependent on the weather. Some other things with the scare program, we tried this year the flare guns, which have two types of flares. One is a banger flare and the other one is a screamer shell, we call it. And the screamer shells definitely work better on the swans. So if any of the farmers are looking at a technique that can scare the birds in the short term, the screamer shells work well. But they don't seem to keep the swans away on a permanent basis, and in order to do that, it appears we have to put some obstruction out in the field. Some of the other things like the air horns, they work when you actually go up to the swans and scare them, but they may come back the same day. So they're limited in use, effective over a short period of time, but over the long term, as I said, some of the techniques of putting flags and streamers in the field work much more effectively.
One of the things that a project of this nature points out is that once again, more questions arise than we can possibly answer. For instance, how many swans do we want? How many swans can the area manage? Is it up to us to control the number? How do we control these numbers? Do we want swans on the farmlands? Is it in the swans' best interest to be fed and supplemented on the farmlands? And if so, at whose expense? What are the consequences for the swans, for the people? One thing we can say is that we definitely do want to see the Trumpeter Swan in the Comox Valley on their next journey south for the winter.